Hey everybody, just wanted to take a few seconds of your time before the podcast starts. Just wanted to let you know about a passion project of mine for the last 3 years called Hustle Focused Energy. It's a powdered drink mix intended to help you focus and accomplish your goals. Super excited to bring this to market. Go check it out, hustletheday.com, and thank you so much for listening. On this episode of the Hustle the Day podcast, I go live on Instagram and talk about the top 10 podcast episodes of 2020. This is a recording of that. Check it out. I want to first of all say thank you to everybody who has listened to the podcast this year or been a guest on the podcast. It's been an awesome experience. It's definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone, pushed me out of my shell, which is exactly what I needed. So I started the podcast just a little bit over a year ago, and so I wanted to go kind of look back at where we started. I actually recorded the first episode in August 2019. I think I recorded a couple more after that and then just kind of sat on them. I kept telling myself I need at least five episodes before I am able to launch the podcast, and then I just kind of got nervous about putting myself out there, all that stuff. So it took a little while to get the actual podcast going. Like I said, it launched a little over a year ago, but it's been a great thing for me personally and a great thing for the Hustle Energy brand. And so I wanted to kind of talk about some of the top podcast episodes of this year in terms of downloads, but then also, some of the great moments. I see Ann Laguza's on here. Thank you, Ann, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate the episode that we did. It was great. Also, shout out to Maria, who just jumped on, another podcast guest. So for anybody who just jumped on, I'm going to recap some of the episodes of 2020, recording this so I can publish it later as well. But just launched, so I just launched the 76th episode of the podcast, and so this will be 77, but I've switched the format up. I'm now doing 2 guest episodes per week, so that should be going up next year in terms of how many episodes I'm able to do each year, to a little over 100, which is going to be awesome. Going to connect with some great individuals, some great people like I already have. But I wanted to count down kind of some of the episodes that I have already done and what was the most popular episodes, which honestly surprised me. So some of the episodes that were most popular in 2020, they were the ones that launched in late last year. Their episodes just kept coming throughout the year. They had the most time, obviously. So not always fair in that regard, but the number one episode was not one that launched last year. So there was a surprise there, but that just bodes well for next year for those that just had their episodes launch. They may be in the top 10 podcast episodes of 2021. So without further ado, going to introduce the 10th most downloaded episode, and that was Prem Kumar. So Prem was one of the first 10 episodes that I did. Very interesting individual. Great talking with him. So he runs a company called Humanly.io, where they basically try to improve both the candidate and the business experience of, resumes, things like that, where they introduce artificial intelligence to keep the applicant more informed, but then also keep help the businesses filter it out so that they get a more quality candidate, and they can remove biases of race and schools. Some people will say, "Oh, they went to Cornell too. Like I've got to have them come in for an interview." So it removes those biases, and Preem also a young father, so we connected in that way, and it's really been great to stay connected with him since that time. Now, it was interesting trying to come up with the stats for this because Preem's episode, since it came out, it was one of the first 10. It's actually been on 3 separate platforms. So I'm taking the stats from the old podcasting platform, the new podcasting platform, which I switched to in April, and then also YouTube. So the video downloads as well, and getting a combined number. So with Preem's episode, I had to gather data from multiple different sources, but he ended up still being the 10th most popular episode, and grateful to have connected with him. Now, the 9th most download episode was somebody I met through another podcast guest. David Alto was the guest that introduced us, and that ended up being number 9, is Gene Girdley. So Gene and I hit it off because he has been in the automotive field for most of his career. Now, he is not a car guy in the typical sense like I am, but it was still good to kind of get the background. He was, behind the scenes at the manufacturers, helping with their training platforms and things like that. So it was really good to connect with him and kind of see the behind the scenes workings of some of these companies that, I enjoy and really like. So it was great to connect with Gene, and I appreciate David for introducing us to, because, David and I have become close out of this. Gene and I have become close out of this. So it was a great opportunity to be able to interview Gene, and we've been talking about some other things coming up in the future as well. That leads us into number 8, and number 8 was kind of a different introduction. So I usually find guests through 2 options, usually referrals from other guests or people that I know, or there is a podcast service that connects hosts and guests together that I use. And this guest I randomly found on Facebook through a Facebook group, and they were asking to be on some podcasts, and I kind of got their background, a little bit their story, and was like, all right, let's do this. And it actually turned out to work out pretty well, because they're the 8th most downloaded episode of 2020, and that is Ashley Cheeks. So Ashley runs Written Success Company, which helps develop business plans for companies. They also have a DIY option as well, so you can kind of write out your own business plan, because statistics show that writing your business plan, you're more likely to succeed. And it was an interesting story with Ashley, not for the traditional sense. She became an entrepreneur out of necessity. So she had she has a, now I just lost my train of thought there. I can't remember if it was a son or a daughter, but she has a child that had some medical needs, and they took a lot of time. So even though she loved her job, she loved what she was doing, she needed more freedom, more flexibility to be able to tend to the needs of this child. So that's where she actually started this company, and it's worked out pretty well for her so far. I've was really able to connect well with her, and it was a great opportunity to have her get her story out there and experience a little bit different perspective of an entrepreneur, somebody who didn't go about it the normal way of, oh, this is always my calling, or I saw the opportunity. It was kind of forced into that situation, but she's made the best of it. And that leads into number 7, who actually is a good friend of mine, Glenn Lovelace. It was the 3rd episode that I ever recorded, and Glenn and I knew each other prior to this, had become friends, and we were able to record at Glenn's office last year, and it was really interesting. He got really deep, really opened up, really vulnerable, and it was something that impacted me, I think, more, at least, more than the typical audience, I guess, because it almost like he was speaking to me. So Glenn, what he does is he's a coach, but he talks. I've referenced his interview numerous times on other podcast episodes, but he talks about helping people through their physical fitness first to get their mind right. And so how he approaches people is, okay, let's get an exercise routine, let's get an eating routine, and then we'll work on your business from there. And so a little bit different roundabout way of doing it, but it works really well for him. And like I said, he broke down, got very open, honest, and vulnerable. He talks about, at one point he had a gun in his mouth and thought he was going to end it all, and then had that spark and turned it around, found his way through physical fitness, and is now trying to help other people as well. I think it's an episode that a lot of people can relate to, where you feel like you don't have it all together, and it's difficult to go through those situations, but really grateful to connect with Glenn and to continue to connect with Glenn. And then he actually ended up going on the next person's podcast, my good friend Thomas McMinn, who was the first episode that I ever recorded with, the first guest episode I ever recorded with. Glenn went on Thomas's podcast about fatherhood, but Thomas ended up being the sixth most popular episode of 2020. And at the time, Thomas was talking about his 4x40 challenge. It's really interesting. So getting down to these last few people, a lot of them have gone through a lot of changes throughout 2020. Like, I feel like I could re-interview them all and we get different stories. 2020 has changed a lot for a lot of people. Honestly, most of the time in good ways. So Thomas was talking about his 4x40 challenge at the time, and a little bit about his podcast, Car Seats and Coffee. And at the time, actually, he was taking a break from Car Seats and Coffee. He had decided it just wasn't the best use of his time. And honestly, he didn't feel like he was making an impact. Me personally, having a podcast, I know the impact that the podcast community can really have on other people. And so I kind of kept telling him, like, hey, you need to get back into this. You don't realize the impact it's having. People need strong father figures. They need those role models. And so you need to get your message out there and interview more dads. And so at the time he was doing his 4x40 challenge, he did end up writing a book about it. But he's now more pivoted back towards that podcast, and is talking about doing a podcast tour this year, this 2021 rather. And so I think there's a lot of good changes since then that have happened for Thomas, and I look forward to seeing what he comes up with next. So the fifth most popular episode of 2020 was somebody that I met through LinkedIn. His name is James Falk. He is a career coach, but really what he does is he actually gets people to the right person to talk to. So rather than submitting your resume through a specific person or through a specific platform like Monster, Indeed, all those different resources that are out there, he actually gets you to talk to the right person. That's what he teaches people how to do. And in doing so, he's created quite a little company for himself. But what really struck me about his episode is the way he does business. You'll have to listen to the episode to really understand how he goes about this, but it was really interesting on how he deals with partnerships, and if the partner's not comfortable, he's not going to move forward with things. Talks about kindness and all these different things of how he manages his business, and it's not the traditional sense. So I definitely implore you to check out James's episode. It was the 5th most popular one of 2020. And somebody who's gone through probably the biggest pivot in 2020 is Marcus Wing. It is the 4th most downloaded episode of 2020. And when I talked with Marcus last year, it was he was doing a what his main source of income. His company is 4FX Productions. They do stage setups, live events, parties, you name it, concerts, things of that nature. And as you can imagine, live events, concerts, parties, all those things pretty much gone in 2020. He's done a couple of hybrid virtual events where they have a guest speaking to an audience, and he set up that stage and things like that, but primarily that income source just disappeared for him. So he's had to take a major pivot, and he started jumping into the world of podcasting. So he is doing podcast production, podcast creation, strategy, so he's very familiar with audio, and obviously jumped into that side of things and jumped into helping people with the audio issues that they might be having and starting a podcast. And then he built out his own podcast studio in a shed at his house, really good looking professional setup. And he still wants to get back to those live events, and he's put on a couple small events, but he also set up movie screens for like neighborhood gatherings. So he'll set it up in a cul-de-sac, and everybody can be spread out and watch a movie on the big screen. That's one of the things he has all this equipment was it going to do, sitting around. And so he's had to make some major pivots throughout this year, but it was a great episode. He's one that I feel like I could completely re-interview and get a completely different story based on 2020. But he was the 4th most downloaded episode of 2020, Marcus Wing. And then the 3rd most popular episode is another good friend, Spider O'Neill. He had a completely different story because he's an entrepreneur. So he works at a company as a leader, and he has no aspirations of really starting his own company. Yeah, he might have a side hustle here and there, and he's done that before. Him and I have run a video production company before. And at this point, he likes what he's doing. He loves the team that he has, and he talks about leadership and entrepreneurship and what you can do to excel within a company and become a better leader. And that really struck a chord with a lot of people. I've heard a lot of great feedback from people about that episode because he is not the typical entrepreneur. For those people who are thinking about, leaving their 9-to-5, but they want to have a little bit more financial security before they do that, this was a great episode to listen to. Somebody that, can relate to that and thinks that there's a lot of opportunity in being an entrepreneur. And I completely agree with that. Some of us are called to different things, and so I'm grateful that I was able to interview him and talk about that, and it was able to resonate with people. So another one that I have heard probably the most feedback on, something that I was really shocked at how many people resonated with this, even though as I'm going through the interview process, I was just like, wow, I'm blown away by this information. And this was the number one podcast, most downloaded podcast for a very long time, up until probably a couple weeks ago. And it was my second episode. There we go. Now that I can, my second episode I ever record. And that was Janelle Van Zant. Janelle, it was just has an infectious personality. She's very likable, very easy to get along with, and it showed through this podcast episode. So she talked about, basically manifesting things out of thin air and hard work, but She talked about how she had started from nothing, not knowing anything, how she traveled along that journey to the point where she was able to build a salon and learn more about the permanent makeup market and create a business out of that. And at the time, she had just launched or was in the process of launching a online platform to teach permanent makeup. And that has since kind of dissolved, but it's caused a new pivot and a new direction for her. She's still in the permanent makeup industry, and she still teaches classes in person for those that are interested in that. That is still her bread and butter, is teaching the permanent makeup. But she moved away from that online platform of teaching that, and she has now moved more towards the single needle tattoo market, which she is doing and teaching as well. And it's something she's definitely passionate about. And at the time, she had a podcast, kind of went away from that for a while and is starting to get back into that. It really has been an interesting year, and it's caused a lot of people to rethink their priorities. And that has been something that Janelle has gone through. And again, I feel like this is one of those episodes where I could re-interview her and get a completely different story, and it would be a really unique experience to do that again. And this leads into the most download episode of 2020. This was an interesting one. So this individual, I met them through a podcasting service where it connects the podcast guest and host, but I'd reached out to them, kind of dug into their story. They were doing a podcast tour, going across multiple podcasts, and I connected with them, and I was like, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast. And they said, great, I am busy for the next couple of weeks, so I can do tomorrow at 9 a.m., or it's going to be several weeks away. And at the time, I was needing an episode sooner than when they could next connect with me. And so it's like, you know what? I actually have time tonight. Rarely do I have time at night. Usually it is, I've got 3 young kids. I've got a wife. It's hard for me to find time in the evening and night to be able to work on that. Well, it just so happened that night, my wife and kids were gone, off on a day trip or something, or over at grandma's. I don't remember the specific aspects of it, but it's like, oh, I actually have time tonight. Let's do it. Let's jump into it. We'll do 9 a.m. tomorrow. Well, I ended up jumping into this person's story and was just fascinated by it. And it ended up, we, connect the next morning, and this individual's like, you are the most prepared podcast guest host that I've ever dealt with. And that's because I honestly became obsessed with their content overnight. And that is Brendan Kumarasamy, who ended up being the most downloaded episode of 2020. He is the founder of Master Talk on YouTube, teaching people how to speak publicly. But what made his story so fascinating is that he grew up near the poverty line, and he went to university, got a good degree, got a 6-figure job, and rather than do the usual thing that everybody does of starting to live that lifestyle, he took himself back to near poverty, still lives with his parents, doesn't own a car, all these things, so that he can give back and build what he really wants to do, which is teach the world how to speak better. Obviously something I need. But he is a really fascinating individual, really well-spoken, obviously, but I was really grateful to connect with him, and I've really become friends with him since then because, like I said, I'm passionate about what he's doing and his vision, and he's passionate about it too and sharing it with people. And so I'm grateful to have connected with Brendan and everybody else that was on the podcast throughout this year. And in the future, I've got some great episodes lined up I'm super excited about. So quick rundown again: top 10 most downloaded podcast episodes of 2020 for the Hustle of the Day podcast. Number 10, Prem Kumar. Number 9, Gene Girdley. Number 8, Ashley Cheeks. Number 7, Glenn Lovelace. Number 6, Thomas McMinn. Number 5, James Falk. Number 4, Marcus Wing. Number 3, Spider O'Neill. Number 2, Janelle Van Zant. And number 1, Brendan Kumarasamy. So thank you, everybody who joined the podcast throughout this journey so far. Look forward to 2021 and what it's going to bring for us. And grateful again for everybody who's ever listened, shared, liked, rated, reviewed, all those great things for the podcast. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Hey, thanks for listening all the way through. Sincerely appreciate it. But hey, since you're here on YouTube, I have a favor to ask. If you got any value out of this podcast, and I know you did, go ahead, hit the subscribe, the like, and the bell notification buttons. That sincerely helps us out, and I truly appreciate anybody who does that.